It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. The House has taken up a spending bill that would add tens of billions of dollars to the Pentagon budget. It's part of an effort from President Trump and the Republicans to expand the already massive amounts of military spending. But they face one hurdle. Their request violates budget caps imposed by law. But that doesn't mean they'll be stopped. Lawmakers have previously used war budgets, which are separate from the Pentagon, to get around budget caps. Well, a new report says to do that, war budgets would have to be more than doubled in an act of, quote, fantasy budgeting. The report is by William Hartung, director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. Welcome, William.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So there are a few different proposals being taken up right now, the one from President Trump as well as other congressional committees. Talk about what they're proposing and this potential conflict with budget caps on Pentagon spending.
Well, the Trump budget, proposal was bad enough. $54 billion above the caps established by law. But Congress took it from there and pushed it higher. So the highest figure is the Senate Armed Services Committee at $91 billion above the caps. There was one exception. The Senate Appropriations Committee came in around the level of the caps. So either they're being more realistic or they're just, holding their powder until the fall when this all gets worked out. But the problem being, as you mentioned, they would have to make unprecedented increases in the war budget, which they've already used as a sort of slush fund to pay for things they can't fit under the caps. But I think some of the conservatives, the fiscal conservatives, especially in the House, would think twice about supporting a budget that doubled the war budget, or what they call the Overseas Contingency Operations Account. So they're due for what could be a bit of a train wreck, which I think could be good in the sense that those huge numbers may not hold. There will still be a very high budget by historical standards, but the more egregious proposals may not make it through the process.
Bill, I have to note the timing of this conversation. We're talking about this massive military budget just one day after President Trump, in announcing he's renewing the ban on transgender members of the military, cited what he called the huge the costs of providing medical treatment to trans members of the armed forces. Can you talk about right now the real areas of massive spending inside the Pentagon, and more about what you mentioned here, this Overseas Contingency Fund, as it's called, being separate from the Pentagon, but as a way to pour massive amounts of money into the military?
Sure. Well, the amount of money spent on transgender medical expenses is a drop in the ocean in the Pentagon's budget. When you look at all the different elements of national security spending, the Pentagon base budget, the war budget, nuclear weapons at the Department of Energy, some other defense-related expenses at places like the FBI, we're pushing up to $650 to $700 billion a year. And as has been mentioned in some press reports, spending by the Pentagon on Viagra is about 10 times what they spend on transgender medical services. They waste $120 billion over the next 5 years, $25 billion a year, even just on excess bureaucracy, much less on any weapon system, many of which are not needed. They're in the midst of a $1 trillion 30-year nuclear weapons buildup at a time when the U.S. has over 4,000 nuclear warheads, a few hundred of which would be enough to deter any country from attacking the United States. And in the face of a recent proposal at the UN to eliminate nuclear weapons globally altogether. So, the cost issue, I think, is a cover story. I think the decision on transgender, access to the military is political. I don't think it has to do with dollars and cents. As for the war budget, even last year, a Pentagon spokesperson said, well, about half of that $30 billion is for what they call enduring requirements, which means things they're going to spend money on anyway, even if we weren't fighting wars in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and so many other places around the world.
Okay, and the official Pentagon budget is around $500 billion a year, right? And of course, Trump and the Republicans want to even increase that. But that doesn't account for the actual total spending that goes into the military, some of which you already discussed. What is the actual sum in your mind?
Well, if you look at the cost of wars, past, present, and future, it goes up to over $1 trillion a year, which is almost double the Pentagon's base budget. And that's things like, treating veterans. That budget's $186 billion a year. Has more than tripled because of the wars of this century. Homeland Security at $50 billion a year. There's interest on the debt related to the Pentagon of $100 billion a year. There's $7 billion in military aid that's located at the State Department. So there's many other elements of sort of the quote unquote national security budget. And these are costs of having interventionary foreign policy, fighting all these wars.
That point there about the debt, so it's not just a matter of spending money directly on military spending. Then you have to put billions of dollars more towards paying down the debt that you accrue on having to pay for it.
Exactly. Roughly speaking, they spend about $500 billion a year just to pay the interest on the debt. And by a conservative estimate, about $100 billion of that would be the result of past Pentagon spending.
There was a study last year from the Cato Institute, sort of a conservative think tank, that said that if the U.S. just reined in its interventionist policies and narrowed its military focus around the world, that could save about $1 trillion over the next decade alone.
Yes. Well, Cato's a little different because they're libertarians, so thankfully they don't share a lot of the conservative views about military intervention, how much to spend on the Pentagon, and so forth, which is why they could take an honest look at what is defense and what is an interventionary foreign policy. So, they've done probably the most thorough look at how much we could save if you had a more narrow view of what U.S. core defense interests are instead of this kind of global interventionism that has sort of run rampant since 2001.
Going back to the budget proposals that are currently before Congress when it comes to military spending, Adam Smith, a Democrat of Washington, he said that the current legislation, he called it the most craven piece of legislation I have witnessed in 20 years. Do you agree with him?
Well, I'd have to kind of fast backwards through the last 20 years, but I think it's certainly a candidate. I think his perspective is, whatever you want to spend on the military, you have to align your strategy with the likely available money. And because they're just throwing up these fantasy numbers, which they themselves may not even be able to produce at the end of the process, even a kind of a moderate on defense would say, well, this is chaos. I mean, if you can only spend a certain amount, you should align your interests, your strategy to that amount. So I think that's part of what he's driving at, as well as things like, the Congress refuses to close unneeded military bases, which would save billions of dollars a year, and which the Pentagon itself has been advocating. So there's this pork barrel politics element where nobody wants to give up a base or a contract in their state or district. And that sort of locks in Pentagon spending at much higher levels than it should be.
And so getting back to the budget caps, you have these sequestration limits imposed by Congress, but they're due to expire in September. In terms of how important it is to Trump and the Republicans to push through their military spending increases, do you think that they're going to fight to boost the caps?
Well, they'll need to do that if they want the kind of money they're talking about. And they have made deals in the past. There was a deal called Ryan Murray a couple of years ago that raised, $15 to $20 billion caps on domestic and Pentagon spending. The problem with that in this Congress is Trump is trying to make deep cuts, almost dollar for dollar, what he increases the Pentagon. But if the deal they're trying to make is you can increase domestic spending at the same rate as Pentagon spending, that doesn't fit with the Republican fiscal conservatives. And so it's not clear how that deal happens. And even if it does happen, that if they could get to these huge levels they would need to get these numbers they're throwing at the wall to see if they might stick.
But I should say, William, there aren't just some who want to raise the cap limits. There are some who want to get rid of the caps at all. What would that mean?
Well, they'd need new legislation, and they'd have to agree, at least for the next 5 years or so, to significant deficit reduction. So they'd have to either increase taxes, cut entitlements, or reduce spending in a consistent fashion. So that's what's kept this thing in place since 2011. Is there's kind of conflicting ideologies and priorities between Democrats and Republicans, as well as some splits in each of the parties. And so that kind of deal has to be made at the highest levels. It's got to be made by the party leadership. So the hawks and the defense committees aren't really fully in control of that.
Finally, William Hartung, if we had a military spending policy that you could set, what would it look like?
Well, I think the Cato figure of cutting $1 trillion over 10 years is reasonable. We probably could go lower, but certainly we don't need this $1 trillion nuclear weapons buildup. We shouldn't be spending 50, 60, $80 billion a year on the war budget. We should be winding down in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Syria. The Trump administration is pushing the troops and the spending higher. We don't need this huge global Navy, because I don't think we should be in the business of being ready to intervene anywhere in the globe. We could reduce the numbers of the Army, Marines, and so forth if we had a truly defensive policy. So there's a lot of areas to look, and that's not even getting started at the tens of billions of dollars of waste that could be eliminated. So certainly we could cut $100 billion, probably quite a bit more from current proposals. And then I think, even at that point, I think we could have an honest discussion about what do we mean by defense, and then, set the budget accordingly.
Well, actually, let me ask you one more question. In terms of the other ways the U.S. spends money on the military without directly funding the Pentagon budget, what about if the U.S. gives billions of dollars in aid to, say, Israel and Egypt, and they condition that aid on the purchase of military hardware from the U.S.? Does that count as part of a military spending budget at all?
Well, it's not in the Pentagon budget. It's in the State Department budget. So in normal discussions, it's not included. I included it in that $1 trillion estimate, but that $1 trillion figure is rarely mentioned in the press. So people don't normally get the full sense of how much of their tax dollars are going for, things that are justified on the concept of national security.
So just to underline that, when we read in the press about a $500 billion approximately Pentagon budget, you're saying the real number is actually double that.
If you look at all the different consequences, some people might say, well, veterans benefits are some cost, because obviously we're not going to stop taking care of our veterans. But if you keep pushing these wars, those numbers will just keep going up and up.
William Hartung, Director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.